The helicopter blades churned overhead as I stepped onto the tarmac at Fort Braxton, North Carolina. 22 years of doubts, whispers, and sideways glances had led to this moment. The weight of 4 silver stars on my chest felt heavier than the full combat gear I wore, but not because of their metal, because of what they represented. Every person who had ever called me too soft for this job was about to eat their words. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was born in the small town of Millbrook, Alabama, population 3,847. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, and where dreams bigger than the county line are often met with polite smiles and gentle discouragement. My father, Robert Mitchell, ran the local hardware store, and my mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. They were good people, salt-of-the-earth types who believed in hard work, Sunday church, and staying within your lane. The first time I mentioned wanting to join the military, I was 8 years old, standing in our kitchen after watching a documentary about World War II. My mother nearly dropped her coffee mug. "Honey, that's not really for girls like us," she said, her voice carrying that particular southern gentleness that somehow made rejection sound like a hug. "Maybe you'd like to be a teacher instead, or a nurse. Those are wonderful careers for women." But I wasn't deterred. Even at 8, I had this fire in my belly that wouldn't be extinguished by well-meaning discouragement. I started reading everything I could get my hands on about military strategy, famous battles, and legendary commanders. While other kids my age were playing with dolls or video games, I was in the backyard setting up elaborate war games with my G.I. Joe action figures, creating complex scenarios and working out tactical solutions. My obsession didn't go unnoticed. By the time I reached middle school, I had earned the nickname Army Barbie from my classmates. It wasn't meant as a compliment. The girls thought I was weird for preferring camouflage to cute outfits. And the boys couldn't wrap their heads around a girl who could outthink them in every strategic game we played. High school brought new challenges. I was 5'4", maybe 115 pounds soaking wet, with blonde hair that I kept in a perpetual ponytail, and green eyes that my grandmother always said were too kind for this world. I looked like I belonged in a cheerleading uniform, not combat boots. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Thornton, called me into her office during my junior year. "Sarah, your grades are exceptional," she said, shuffling through my transcript. "You could get into any college you want. Have you considered pre-med? Or maybe law? You have the mind for it." "I want to go to West Point," I replied without hesitation. Mrs. Thornton's smile faltered. "Oh, honey, that's a very difficult path. The physical requirements alone, and it's such a male-dominated field. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more suitable?" There was that word again, suitable. As if my dreams needed to fit into a neat little box that society had pre-approved for someone who looked like me. My parents weren't much more supportive, don't get me wrong, they loved me fiercely and wanted the best for me. But their idea of the best didn't include their daughter potentially being shot at in some foreign country. The dinner table conversations became increasingly tense as my senior year approached. "Sarah, we just think you're too gentle for that kind of life," my father said one evening over meatloaf and mashed potatoes. "You cry when you see roadkill. How are you going to handle real combat?" "Dad, empathy isn't weakness," I shot back, though his words stung because I knew there was truth in them. I did cry at sad movies. I did feel things deeply. But I also knew that caring about people was what made good leaders, not what disqualified them from service. My mother nodded along with my father. "Plus, you're so small, sweetheart. The military is about physical strength, and you're just, well, you're delicate." Delicate. Another word that would haunt me for years. Despite their concerns, I pressed forward with my West Point application. I threw myself into physical training with the intensity of someone whose life depended on it. Every morning at 5 a.m., I was running the back roads of Millbrook, pushing my body to limits I didn't know existed. I joined the school's ROTC program, where I was one of only 3 girls in a class of 35. The ROTC instructor, Major James Harrison, was a gruff man in his 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He'd served 3 tours in Iraq and had little patience for what he called weekend warriors. I could tell from day one that he had his doubts about me. "Mitchell," he barked during our first field exercise, "you're holding up the entire squad. Move it!" I was struggling with a 30-pound rucksack during a 5-mile march, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. I finished dead last, but I finished. After the exercise, Major Harrison pulled me aside. "Look, Mitchell, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't Girl Scouts. Maybe you should consider joining the debate team instead." His words lit a fire in me that I carry to this day. "With respect, sir, I'm not going anywhere." Over the following months, I proved him wrong. Slowly but surely, I began to excel. My small size, which everyone saw as a disadvantage, actually worked in my favor during stealth exercises. I could move through terrain without being detected, and my agility allowed me to navigate obstacles that larger recruits struggled with. But it was my strategic mind that really set me apart. During war games and tactical exercises, I consistently outmaneuvered my peers. I could see patterns and possibilities that others missed, and I had an intuitive understanding of how to use terrain, weather, and psychology to gain advantages. Major Harrison began to take notice. After a particularly successful mission simulation, where I led my team to victory against seemingly impossible odds, he called me into his office. "Mitchell," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you." "Sir? You've got something special, something that can't be taught." He paused, studying my face. "You've got the mind of a general, but you're going to have to prove it to a lot of people who are going to judge you based on what they see on the surface." His words were prophetic. When my West Point acceptance letter arrived in the spring of my senior year, the reaction in Millbrook was mixed. Some people were genuinely proud and supportive. Others seemed almost offended that someone like me would dare to reach so high. The local newspaper ran a small article about my acceptance, and the comments section was brutal. "She'll wash out in the first month," wrote one anonymous commenter. West Point isn't a place for soft little girls playing soldier. But perhaps the most hurtful reaction came from someone I thought was a friend. Jessica Martinez had been my study partner throughout high school, and we'd grown close over late-night cramming sessions and shared dreams of college success. When she heard about my West Point acceptance, her response was devastating. "Sarah, I just don't understand why you're doing this to yourself," she said as we sat in her car after school. "You're setting yourself up for failure. Everyone knows you're too soft for the military. You're going to get hurt, or worse, you're going to get other people hurt, because you can't handle the pressure." Her words hit me like a physical blow. This was coming from someone who knew me better than almost anyone. Someone who had seen me work through complex problems and push through challenges. If she doubted me, what hope did I have of convincing strangers? That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jessica's words echoing in my mind. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I was deluding myself. Maybe I was too soft, too small, too gentle for the world I was about to enter. But then I thought about all the books I'd read about military leaders throughout history. I thought about the strategic puzzles I'd solved, the physical challenges I'd overcome, and the fire that had been burning in my belly since I was 8 years old. I thought about Major Harrison's words, "You've got the mind of a general." I made a decision that night that would shape the rest of my life. I wasn't going to let other people's limitations become my own. I was going to West Point, and I was going to succeed, not despite being too soft, but because my compassion and empathy would make me a better leader than those who led through fear and intimidation alone. The summer before West Point was a whirlwind of preparation. I trained harder than I ever had before, pushing my body to new limits. I studied everything I could about military history, strategy, and leadership. I was determined to arrive at the academy not just ready, but ahead of the curve. My parents threw me a going-away party the week before I left for New York. Half the town showed up, and the mood was bittersweet. There were congratulations mixed with barely concealed skepticism, well wishes tinged with doubts. As I stood in our backyard, surrounded by people who had watched me grow up, I overheard a conversation that crystallized everything I was feeling. "She's got heart, I'll give her that," said Tom Bradley, who owned the gas station on Main Street. "But heart only gets you so far. The military is about being tough, and Sarah's just, well, she's always been too soft for that kind of life." His companion nodded. Pretty little thing like that doesn't belong in combat. She'll be back home within a year, mark my words. I pretended not to hear them, but their words burned themselves into my memory. Too soft, pretty little thing, doesn't belong. As I packed my bags that final night, I made a promise to myself. I would prove them all wrong. Every person who had ever doubted me, every voice that had told me I was too soft, too small, too gentle, they would all eat their words. I had no idea then that it would take 22 years and a career that would test every fiber of my being. I had no idea that I would face combat situations that would push me to my breaking point, command decisions that would keep me awake at night, and political battles that would make military combat seem simple by comparison. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But I also had no idea that the very qualities they saw as weaknesses, my empathy, my compassion, my ability to see beyond the surface, would become my greatest strengths as a leader. The bus to West Point left Millbrook at 6 a.m. on a humid July morning. As I watched my hometown disappear in the rear window, I carried with me not just my bags and my dreams, but the weight of everyone's expectations, both positive and negative. I was Sarah Mitchell from Millbrook, Alabama, the girl who was too soft for the military, but I was about to become something else entirely. The question was, what would I have to sacrifice to get there? West Point hit me like a freight train wrapped in tradition and soaked in sweat. The United States Military Academy wasn't just a school. It was a machine designed to break you down and rebuild you from the ground up. And from the moment I stepped off that bus in Beast Barracks, I knew I was in for the fight of my life. My roommate was Amanda Chen from San Francisco, a tall, athletic girl whose father had been a Marine colonel. She took one look at me, all 5'4" of me with my carefully packed bags and nervous smile, and I could practically see the doubt flash across her face. "So you're the one from Alabama," she said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone making an observation about an interesting specimen. "I heard about you from my dad. He knows some people in ROTC down south." I wondered what exactly she'd heard, but I didn't ask. I was too busy trying to process the organized chaos that was our day, reception day, the beginning of cadet basic training, or as everyone called it, Beast Barracks. The upperclassmen descended on us like wolves on sheep. Every movement was scrutinized, every word dissected, every breath monitored. I'd expected it to be tough, but the reality was something else entirely. These weren't the good-natured drill sergeants from movies. These were battle-hardened cadets who had earned the right to make our lives miserable, and they took their job seriously. "New Cadet Mitchell!" The voice belonged to Cadet First Class Robert Kane, a mountain of a man from Texas who looked like he'd been carved from granite. "What makes you think you belong here?" "Sir, I want to serve my country, sir." He circled me like a shark. "I've seen your file, Mitchell, 5'4", 115 pounds. You look like you belong in a sorority, not the United States Army. Are you sure you didn't take a wrong turn somewhere?" The other new cadets stood at attention, but I could feel their eyes on me, some sympathetic, others curious, a few openly skeptical. This was my first real test, and everyone was watching. "Sir, I belong here as much as anyone else, sir." Kane's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "We'll see about that, new cadet. We'll see about that." The next 6 weeks were a blur of physical training, academic instruction, and psychological warfare. Every day began at 0530 with formation, followed by physical fitness training that pushed every muscle in my body to its limit. I struggled with some of the purely strength-based exercises. I couldn't do as many pull-ups as the men, and my push-ups were a constant battle. But I discovered something about myself during those grueling weeks. Where others saw weakness, I found different paths to strength. During obstacle courses, my small size allowed me to navigate tight spaces and low crawls with ease. My endurance, built from years of running Alabama back roads, served me well during long marches. In my mind, my strategic, analytical mind helped me excel in the classroom portions of training. The real test came during a field exercise in week 4. We were divided into squads and given a mission: navigate through hostile territory to reach an objective while avoiding enemy forces played by upperclassmen. Most squads took direct routes, relying on speed and aggression. I suggested a different approach. "We go around," I told my squad mates during our planning session. "Use the terrain to our advantage. Take longer but avoid contact entirely." Cadet Jackson Williams from Detroit shook his head. "That's not how you fight a war, Mitchell. You engage the enemy and destroy them." "Not if you can accomplish the mission without fighting," I countered. "Why take casualties when you don't have to?" The squad was split, but we were running out of time. Eventually, they agreed to try my approach. We moved through the exercise area like ghosts, using creek beds and tree lines to mask our movement. While other squads got bogged down in firefights with the enemy, we slipped past undetected and reached our objective first. When the after-action review came, the evaluating officer, a captain named David Torres, studied our performance with interest. "Interesting tactical choice, Mitchell," he said. "Most cadets your age think warfare is about who can hit hardest. You understand that the best battles are sometimes the ones you don't fight." It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. For the first time since arriving at West Point, I felt like maybe I did belong here. But the academy had other plans for my confidence. Academic year brought new challenges. The coursework was brutal. Engineering, mathematics, history, philosophy, and military science, all crammed into days that seemed to have too few hours. I held my own academically, but it was the social dynamics that proved most challenging. My company was a mix of personalities and backgrounds, but I quickly realized that I occupied a unique space. The male cadets saw me as either a curiosity or a challenge to be overcome. Some were openly dismissive, others overly protective in a way that was almost more insulting than outright hostility. The female cadets presented their own challenges. There were only about 150 women in our class of 1,000, and we were constantly being compared to each other. Some of the women had embraced a hyper-aggressive persona, as if proving their toughness by being harder than the men. Others tried to fly under the radar, hoping to avoid attention entirely. I found myself caught in the middle, too soft for the hard chargers, too ambitious for the wallflowers. The breaking point came during our first major field training exercise in the Hudson Valley. We were simulating a complex urban warfare scenario, and I'd been appointed as a squad leader, a position that came with significant responsibility and scrutiny. My squad consisted of 8 cadets, including Marcus Rodriguez from Phoenix, a former high school football player who'd made it clear he didn't appreciate taking orders from someone he could probably bench press. There was also Emily Watson from Oregon, quiet and competent, and 6 others who ranged from supportive to openly skeptical. The mission was to clear a series of buildings while minimizing casualties, both our own and civilian. The scenario was designed to test our decision-making under pressure and our ability to balance aggression with restraint. We approached the first building, and I could feel the tension in my squad. Rodriguez was champing at the bit to kick in doors and overwhelm any resistance. Others were looking to me for guidance, waiting to see if I'd fold under pressure. "We're going to take this slow and methodical," I told them. "Every room gets cleared properly, every corner gets checked, we don't leave anyone behind, and we don't make any assumptions." Rodriguez's frustration was evident. "Mitchell, we're going to be here all day at this rate. The other squads are going to finish while we're still picking our way through the first floor." "Speed without precision is just chaos," I replied. "We do this right." We moved through the building systematically. My approach was paying off. We successfully identified and neutralized threats while avoiding civilian casualties. But as we approached the final room, everything went sideways. The scenario called for a hostage situation, a terrorist holding a civilian at gunpoint. The standard response would be an immediate assault, but something about the setup bothered me. The positioning was wrong. The hostage-taker's behavior didn't match the profile we'd been given. "Hold," I ordered, raising my hand to stop the squad's advance. "What are you doing?" Rodriguez hissed. "We need to move now." But I was studying the scene, processing details that others had missed. The hostage was positioned in a way that suggested she might actually be another threat. The terrorist's weapon was pointed at an angle that would make it difficult to actually harm the hostage. "It's a trap," I realized. "There's a second shooter." I was right. Hidden in the shadows was another enemy combatant, positioned to catch any assault team in a crossfire. My hesitation had saved us from walking into an ambush. The exercise evaluators were impressed. "Outstanding tactical awareness, Cadet Mitchell," said Major Patricia Summers, the officer in charge of the exercise. "You read the situation correctly and adapted your response accordingly." But my moment of triumph was short-lived. As we returned to the barracks, I overheard a conversation that cut deeper than any criticism I'd faced so far. "Did you see Mitchell back there?" It was Cadet Kevin Foster, one of the upperclassmen who'd been observing the exercise. She hesitated for like 30 seconds before making a decision. In real combat, that kind of indecision gets people killed. His companion nodded. "She's too soft for this job. Always overthinking, always looking for the gentle way out. That's fine for a training exercise, but when bullets start flying for real, you need someone who can make hard choices fast." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I'd thought I was demonstrating tactical intelligence, but they saw hesitation. Where I saw careful analysis, they saw weakness. That night, I sat in my room staring at a letter from home. My mother had written about the church social, the new teacher at the elementary school, and how proud everyone was of me. But between the lines, I could read her worry. She still thought I was too gentle for this world, still feared that I was setting myself up for heartbreak. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I was too soft, too thoughtful, too concerned with finding perfect solutions in a world that demanded quick and dirty answers. The doubt began to eat at me like acid. During physical training, I pushed myself harder, trying to prove that I could be as tough as anyone. During tactical exercises, I made faster decisions, sometimes second-guessing my instincts in favor of more aggressive approaches. But trying to be someone I wasn't only made things worse. My performance began to suffer. I was making mistakes I'd never made before, hesitating when I should have been confident, and being aggressive when the situation called for restraint. The low point came during a winter survival exercise in the Adirondack Mountains. We were operating in sub-zero temperatures, and I was leading a patrol through difficult terrain. The cold was brutal, and several members of my team were struggling. Cadet Michael Zhang from Los Angeles was in particular trouble. He'd grown up in a warm climate and was having difficulty adjusting to the extreme cold. His movements were becoming sluggish, and I could see the early signs of hypothermia setting in. The mission parameters called for us to reach a checkpoint within a specific time frame. Stopping to help Zhang would put us behind schedule and potentially result in a failed exercise. The hard choice would be to leave him with minimal gear and continue the mission. Camastore affaire. But I couldn't do it. Despite everything I'd been told about being too soft, despite all the criticism about my decision-making, I couldn't leave a teammate behind. "We're stopping," I announced. "Zhang needs medical attention." The protests were immediate. "Mitchell, if we stop now, we fail the exercise," said Cadet Lisa Park from Nevada. "Is that what you want?" "I want everyone to come home alive," I replied. "The mission isn't worth a casualty." We established a temporary shelter and worked to warm Zhang up. It took an hour that put us hopelessly behind schedule. When we finally reached the checkpoint, the evaluating officer was waiting with a clipboard and a frown. "Cadet Mitchell," said Captain Rebecca Stone, "you failed to complete the mission within the specified time frame. Can you explain your decision?" I explained about Zhang's condition and our response. Captain Stone nodded but didn't look impressed. "In combat, you'll face situations where you have to choose between mission success and individual welfare. Today, you chose welfare over mission. That's a choice that could get a lot more people killed in the long run." The official evaluation was brutal. Cadet Mitchell shows excessive concern for individual team members at the expense of mission objectives. Demonstrates leadership qualities but lacks the decisiveness necessary for combat command. Excessive concern. There it was again. The idea that caring too much was a flaw, that my empathy was a weakness that would make me ineffective as a leader. But something unexpected happened in the days following the exercise. Zhang sought me out during evening study time. "Hey, Mitchell," he said, sitting down across from me in the library. "I wanted to thank you for what you did out there." "You don't need to thank me," I replied. "Any leader would have done the same thing." Zhang shook his head. "No, they wouldn't have. I heard Foster and some of the others talking about how they would have handled it. They said they'd have left me behind to complete the mission. He paused, studying my face. You saved my life out there, and you took a hit to your evaluation to do it. That's not weakness. That's courage. His words planted a seed that would take months to fully grow. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was too soft. Maybe the problem was that I was trying to be something I wasn't. The realization came gradually, through a series of small moments and conversations. I began to notice that the cadets who seemed most eager to prove their toughness were often the ones who made the poorest decisions under pressure. Meanwhile, some of the most effective leaders I encountered were those who combined strength with wisdom, aggression with restraint. During a military history class, we studied the leadership styles of various commanders throughout history. Professor Colonel James Mitchell, no relation, posed a question that would stick with me for years. What makes a great military leader, he asked. Is it the ability to inspire fear in your enemies, or the ability to inspire loyalty in your troops? The class was split in their answers, but I found myself thinking about the leaders I'd read about who had achieved both. Commanders who were feared by their enemies precisely because they were so beloved by their soldiers. As my second year at West Point progressed, I began to find my authentic leadership voice. Instead of trying to be the toughest person in the room, I focused on being the most prepared. Instead of making the fastest decisions, I worked on making the smartest ones. Instead of leading through intimidation, I led through competence and care. The change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always appreciated. There were still plenty of people who saw my approach as weakness, who whispered that I was too soft for real leadership. But gradually, something shifted in how others perceived me. During a complex multi-day field exercise, I was given command of a company-sized unit, over 100 cadets. The mission was to conduct a series of coordinated attacks against a well-defended position, and the odds were stacked against us. Instead of ordering frontal assaults, I spent hours studying the terrain and enemy positions. I talked to every squad leader, listened to their concerns, and incorporated their insights into my planning. When we finally moved, it was with a level of coordination and precision that surprised even me. We completed the mission with minimal casualties and maximum effectiveness. The after-action review was glowing, but what meant more to me were the comments from my subordinates. "Mitchell actually listens to us," said one squad leader. "She doesn't just give orders. She explains why we're doing things and how our piece fits into the bigger picture." Another added, "She's tough when she needs to be, but she's not trying to prove anything. She just wants to get the job done right." As I entered my final 2 years at West Point, I carried with me a new understanding of what leadership could be. The voices that had called me too soft were still there, but they were joined by others. Voices that recognized that true strength wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive, but about being the most effective. The girl from Millbrook, Alabama, was still there inside me, but she was no longer trying to hide. She had become my secret weapon. Graduation from West Point should have been the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Instead, it felt like stepping from one battlefield into an entirely different war. As Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, I was assigned to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. The reality of leading actual soldiers, not fellow cadets, hit me the moment I walked into my first unit briefing. My platoon sergeant was Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a 20-year veteran from Detroit who'd served 4 deployments in Afghanistan. He was everything I wasn't: tall, intimidating, with scars on his hands that told stories I could only imagine. When he first laid eyes on me, his expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the skepticism written in the lines around his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful but cool, "the men are forming up for your introduction." The men. 32 paratroopers, most of them older than me. All of them more experienced in the realities of military life. As I walked toward the formation, I caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Looks like she's about 16. Bet she's never been in a real fight. Hope she doesn't get us killed." The doubt was palpable, but this time it felt different. At West Point, skepticism was part of the training environment. Here, it was personal. These soldiers would follow my orders into combat, and their lives would depend on my decisions. I stood before the formation, feeling the weight of their collective judgment. This was it, my first real test as a leader outside the academy's controlled environment. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying farther than I expected. "I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if this young lieutenant has what it takes to lead you. You're questioning whether someone who looks like she should be teaching kindergarten can handle the responsibilities of combat leadership." A few surprised glances passed between the soldiers. Most junior officers played it safe in their first speeches, sticking to generic platitudes about honor and duty. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend I have all the answers," I continued. "I'm not going to claim I'm tougher than you, or that I've seen more combat than you. What I will tell you is this. I will never ask you to do something I wouldn't do myself. I will never make a decision without considering how it affects each of you. And I will never, ever, give up on bringing every one of you home safely." The formation was silent, but I could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Not acceptance, not yet, but curiosity. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward. "Ma'am, the men would like to know about your combat experience." It was a loaded question. We all knew I had zero combat experience. But Thompson was giving me a chance to be honest, rather than trying to bluff my way through. "I've never been in combat, Sergeant," I said simply, "but I've studied every battle, every tactical situation, every leadership challenge I could get my hands on. I've learned from the mistakes and successes of officers who came before me. And I plan to learn from every one of you." After the formation, Thompson approached me privately. "Ma'am, that was different. Most new lieutenants either try to come off as hardasses or they apologize for existing. You did neither." "I figured honesty was the best policy," I replied. He nodded slowly. "The men appreciate that, but they're still going to test you. They need to know you can handle the pressure when things get real." He was right. Over the next few weeks, I faced a series of subtle challenges that felt like initiation rituals. Equipment would mysteriously malfunction during training exercises. Reports would be submitted just past deadlines. Small insubordinations would pop up to see how I'd respond. The breaking point came during a night training exercise in the Tennessee mountains. We were practicing small unit tactics, and I'd positioned my squads in what I thought was an optimal defensive formation. But Private First Class Danny Morrison, a soldier from Texas with a reputation for pushing boundaries, decided to test my authority. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying just enough disrespect to be noticed by the other soldiers, "this position is all wrong. Sergeant Rodriguez says we should be up on that ridgeline." Every eye in the platoon turned to me. This was the moment Thompson had warned me about, the test that would determine whether I could actually lead these men or if I'd fold under pressure. The old Sarah might have questioned herself, might have worried about being too harsh. But 4 years at West Point had taught me that respect was earned through consistency, not through being liked. "Private Morrison," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge of steel, "you will execute the plan as ordered. If you have tactical suggestions, you will present them through proper channels at the appropriate time. Is that understood?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I just think—" "I didn't ask what you think, Private. I asked if you understood your orders." The standoff lasted about 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, Morrison nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." "Outstanding. Now move to your position." Later that evening, Sergeant Thompson pulled me aside again. "Ma'am, how did you know Morrison was testing you?" "Same way I knew Rodriguez never suggested that position," I replied. "Morrison's been probing for weaknesses since day one. If I'd backed down, I'd have lost the respect of the entire platoon." Thompson's grin was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Ma'am, you're gonna do just fine." But earning the respect of my platoon was only the beginning. 3 months into my assignment, word came down that we were deploying to Afghanistan. The war was winding down, but there were still dangerous missions to be completed, still lives on the line. The deployment briefing was conducted by Colonel Patricia Williams, a 30-year veteran who'd broken more glass ceilings than I could count. She was everything I aspired to be: tough, competent, and respected by every soldier in her command. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you're heading into a complex operational environment. The enemy is adaptive, the terrain is challenging, and the stakes are real. Some of you are combat veterans. Others are about to experience warfare for the first time." Her eyes found mine across the briefing room. "New experiences test us in ways we can't predict. The officer you think you are in garrison might be very different from the officer you become in combat. The question isn't whether you'll be tested, it's how you'll respond when that test comes." The flight to Afghanistan was the longest 12 hours of my life. I sat surrounded by my soldiers, watching them prepare for combat in their own ways. Some slept, others checked and rechecked their equipment. A few wrote letters home that they hoped they'd never have to send. I found myself thinking about all the people back home who doubted me. My mother, who still sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and worried letters. My father, who'd never quite understood why I'd chosen this path. The voices from high school that had called me too soft, too gentle, too weak for this world. Forward Operating Base Wolverine was located in Helmand Province, a dusty collection of concrete barriers and prefabricated buildings that had been carved out of the Afghan desert. It was my first glimpse of a real war zone, and the reality was both more mundane and more terrifying than I'd imagined. The base operated under constant, low-level threat. Mortars would occasionally drop in the outer perimeter. Convoy operations faced the constant danger of improvised explosive devices. Every mission carried the possibility of contact with hostile forces. My first combat mission came 2 weeks after our arrival. Intelligence had identified a compound suspected of housing Taliban fighters who'd been conducting attacks on coalition forces. My platoon was tasked with conducting a raid to capture or neutralize the targets. As we prepared for the mission, I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. These weren't training exercises with blank ammunition and simulated casualties. The bullets would be real, the explosions would be deadly, and my decisions would determine who came home alive. Sergeant Thompson approached me as I was conducting my final equipment check. "Ma'am, you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "The men are good to go, they trust you," he paused, studying my face. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so, you've got something most officers don't have." "What's that?" "You listen. You actually care about what happens to us. That matters more than you might think." The mission launched at 0300 hours. We moved through the Afghan countryside in armored vehicles, the desert landscape illuminated by night vision goggles that turned the world into shades of green and black. The compound was located in a valley surrounded by rocky hills, terrain that offered both concealment and potential danger. As we approached the target, I found myself running through every tactical scenario I'd studied at West Point. The layout of the compound, the likely escape routes, the positioning of my squads, every detail had been planned and rehearsed, but I knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy. The assault began at 0445 hours. My first squad moved to secure the perimeter, while my second squad prepared to breach the main building. Everything was going according to plan, until we encountered something the intelligence briefing hadn't mentioned: civilians. The compound wasn't just a Taliban hideout. It was also home to a family, an elderly man, his wife, and 3 young children who were huddled in a corner of the main room, terrified and crying. This was the moment Colonel Williams had warned me about, the test that would define what kind of officer I really was. The Taliban fighters were using the family as human shields, positioned so that any direct assault would put the civilians at risk. Standard operating procedure called for immediate action, neutralize the threat, and sort out the collateral damage later. But I couldn't do it. Looking at those children, seeing the terror in their eyes, I made a decision that would haunt me for months. "Hold your fire," I ordered over the radio. "We have civilians in the building." The response was immediate and incredulous. "Ma'am, we need to take those fighters now," came the voice of squad leader Sergeant Davis. "They're going to slip away if we hesitate." I said, "Hold your fire," I repeated. "We're going to find another way." For the next 30 minutes, we conducted a careful, methodical operation to separate the civilians from the combatants. It was dangerous, time-consuming, and exactly the kind of hesitation that my critics had always warned would get people killed. But it worked. We captured 2 Taliban fighters and recovered a cache of weapons and explosive materials. More importantly, we did it without harming a single civilian. The after-action review was mixed. On one hand, the mission was a tactical success. On the other hand, several senior officers questioned my decision to delay the assault. "Lieutenant Mitchell," said Major Robert Hayes, the battalion operations officer, "your concern for civilian casualties is commendable, but you took unnecessary risks with your soldiers' lives. Those fighters could have escaped during your delay." "Sir, they didn't escape. We accomplished the mission with 0 friendly casualties and 0 civilian casualties. I believe that's the definition of success." Major Hayes wasn't convinced. "In combat, you need to make hard choices quickly. Today you got lucky. Next time, that hesitation could cost lives." There was that word again, hesitation. The same criticism that had followed me since West Point. The same suggestion that my careful, thoughtful approach was a weakness rather than a strength. But something had changed in me during that mission. For the first time, I'd made a combat decision based on my own judgment rather than on what others expected of me. And it worked. The real validation came from my soldiers. As we returned to base, Private Morrison, the same soldier who'd challenged me during training, approached me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there before, "what you did back there, that took guts." A lot of officers would have just blown through that building and called it acceptable losses. Sergeant Thompson nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, the men are talking. They're saying you're the kind of officer they want to follow into combat. Someone who cares about doing things right, not just getting things done." Over the following months, my platoon conducted dozens of missions throughout Helmand Province. Each one presented its own challenges and moral complexities. We faced ambushes, roadside bombs, and close-quarters combat. We lost soldiers, good men who died doing their duty in a foreign land. But we also saved lives. We protected civilians, captured enemy fighters, and disrupted terrorist networks. And we did it with a level of precision and care that was becoming my trademark. The critics were still there, of course. There were officers who thought I was too cautious, too concerned with minimizing casualties, too willing to take risks to protect non-combatants. But their voices were being drowned out by something else: results. My platoon had one of the lowest casualty rates in the battalion, but also one of the highest mission success rates. We were getting the job done, and we were bringing our people home. As my deployment neared its end, I received an unexpected visit from Colonel Williams. She found me in my quarters, writing letters to the families of soldiers we'd lost. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said, taking a seat across from my desk, "I've been watching your performance over the past year. I want to talk to you about your future." "Ma'am? You've developed into exactly the kind of officer this army needs. You combine tactical competence with moral courage. You care about your soldiers, but you don't let that care paralyze you. You're tough when you need to be, but you're not trying to prove how tough you are." She paused, studying the letters I'd been writing. "I'm recommending you for early promotion and assignment to the Command and General Staff College. It's time to start preparing you for higher command." Higher command. The words sent a thrill through me that I tried to suppress. "Ma'am, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility." Colonel Williams smiled. "Lieutenant, the fact that you're questioning your readiness is exactly why you're ready. The officers who worry me are the ones who never doubt themselves." As I prepared to leave Afghanistan, I thought about the girl from Millbrook, Alabama, who'd been told she was too soft for military service. She seemed like a different person now. Not because she'd become harder, but because she'd learned that true strength wasn't about being the toughest person in the room. It was about being the smartest, the most prepared, and the most committed to the welfare of the people you led. The voices that had called me too soft were still there, but they were joined by new voices. Voices that recognized that caring deeply about your mission and your people wasn't a weakness. It was the foundation of everything that made a leader worth following. 15 years passed in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. 15 years of climbing ranks, facing challenges that would have broken the girl from Millbrook, and proving that leadership wasn't about conforming to someone else's definition of strength. The Army had taken me from Afghanistan to Iraq, from the Pentagon to bases across 3 continents, and through command positions that tested every principle I'd developed about what it meant to lead. Major Sarah Mitchell became Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, then Colonel Mitchell, then Brigadier General Mitchell. Each promotion brought new skeptics who questioned whether someone with my approach could handle the increased responsibility. Each assignment gave me new opportunities to prove them wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while I was serving as Deputy Commanding General of Fort Bragg. Secretary of Defense Margaret Chen's voice on the secure line was crisp and professional, but I could hear the weight of significance in her words. General Mitchell, the President has nominated you for promotion to full general and assignment as Commanding General of United States Army Forces Command. The Senate confirmation hearings begin next week. 4 stars. The culmination of everything I'd worked toward, and simultaneously the beginning of the biggest challenge of my career. FORSCOM commanded over 750,000 soldiers across multiple installations, the largest command in the Army, responsible for training, equipping, and deploying forces worldwide. The news leaked before the official announcement, and my phone began ringing immediately. The first call was from my mother, now in her 70s, but still the same woman who'd once worried that I was too gentle for military service. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I saw it on the news. 4 stars. I can hardly believe it." "Mom, the Senate still has to confirm me. It's not official yet." "Oh, they'll confirm you," she said with a certainty that surprised me. "You know, I need to tell you something. I was wrong all those years ago when I said you were too soft for this. I didn't understand then that caring about people was exactly what the military needed." The confirmation hearings were scheduled for the following Tuesday in the Hart Senate office building. As I prepared my testimony, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every criticism, every doubt, every voice that had told me I didn't belong, they had all contributed to making me the leader I'd become. Senator Patricia Reynolds from Montana, the chair of the Armed Services Committee, led the questioning. She was known for her tough interrogations and her skepticism of military leaders who she felt were too political or too cautious. "General Mitchell," she began, her voice echoing through the hearing room, "you've had an impressive career, but some have criticized your leadership style as being too focused on consensus building and risk aversion. In your opinion, does this criticism have merit?" The question I'd been expecting for 22 years. The same criticism that had followed me from West Point to Afghanistan, from my first command to my current position. But now, with decades of experience and results to back me up, I had a different answer. "Senator, I believe that effective leadership requires both courage and wisdom. There's a difference between being risk-averse and being strategically thoughtful. In my experience, the leaders who achieve lasting success are those who understand that every decision affects real people, with real families who want them to come home safely." Senator William Crawford from Texas, a former Marine, leaned forward. "General, we've reviewed your combat record. You've been commended for your tactical successes, but also criticized for what some call excessive caution. How do you respond to claims that your leadership style prioritizes avoiding casualties over achieving objectives?" "Senator, with respect, I reject the premise that those are competing priorities. In my 22 years of service, I've learned that the most effective way to achieve objectives is to ensure that your people trust your judgment and believe in your mission. Soldiers fight harder for leaders they believe care about their welfare." The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering everything from budget management to strategic planning to my views on military readiness. But the moment that would be replayed on news programs nationwide came when Senator Reynolds asked her final question. "General Mitchell, you'll be the youngest 4-star general in Army history and one of only a handful of women to hold this rank. What would you say to young women who are considering military careers, but worry they might not be tough enough for military service?" I thought about the 8-year-old girl in Millbrook who'd watched that World War II documentary. I thought about the high school senior who'd been told she was too delicate for West Point. I thought about every woman who'd ever been told she didn't belong in a world designed for men. Senator, I would tell them that the military doesn't need them to be someone they're not. It needs them to be the best version of who they are. Some of the toughest people I've ever served with have been women who brought different perspectives, different strengths, and different ways of solving problems. The question isn't whether you're tough enough, it's whether you're committed enough to serve something larger than yourself. The committee voted unanimously to confirm my nomination. 2 weeks later, I stood in the Pentagon auditorium, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues, as Secretary Chen pinned the 4 silver stars to my uniform. But the real moment of vindication came afterward, during the reception. General Patricia Williams, now retired but still commanding respect wherever she went, approached me with a smile that spoke volumes. "Sarah," she said, using my first name for the first time in our decades-long relationship, "do you remember what I told you before your first deployment? That combat would test who you really were?" "Yes, ma'am." "I was wrong. Combat didn't change who you were. It revealed who you'd always been. A leader who understands that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." My first major challenge as FORSCOM commander came 6 months into my tenure. Intelligence reports indicated a significant terrorist threat developing in Eastern Europe, requiring rapid deployment of substantial forces to support NATO allies. The mission would be complex, involving coordination between multiple branches of service and international partners. The planning session brought together dozens of senior officers, each with their own perspectives on how to execute the operation. The conventional wisdom favored a massive, overwhelming deployment, maximum force to ensure rapid success. But as I studied the intelligence reports and political situation, I saw opportunities for a more nuanced approach. The terrorist threat was real, but the region was also dealing with refugee populations and civilian infrastructure damage from previous conflicts. "Gentlemen," I announced during the planning session, "we're going to modify the operational approach." Major General Robert Kim, my chief of staff, looked up from his notes. "Ma'am, the current plan has unanimous support from the Joint Staff." "I understand that, but I believe we can achieve our objectives while also addressing the humanitarian situation. We're going to integrate civilian assistance operations into our military mission." The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some officers nodded in agreement, recognizing the strategic value of winning hearts and minds. Others looked skeptical, clearly thinking that I was overcomplicating a straightforward military operation. Brigadier General Monica Stevens, one of my division commanders, raised her hand. "General, with respect, adding humanitarian operations will slow our response time and divert resources from the primary mission." Brigadier General Stevens, "I disagree. The humanitarian crisis is creating conditions that terrorist organizations exploit for recruitment and support. By addressing both the security threat and the underlying problems, we achieve more sustainable results." The operation, dubbed Operation Steady Shield, became a case study in modern military strategy. Instead of simply deploying overwhelming force, we created integrated teams that combined combat operations with infrastructure repair, medical assistance, and refugee support. The results exceeded all expectations. Not only did we successfully neutralize the terrorist threat, but we also established relationships with local populations that provided ongoing intelligence and support. The operation cost 30% less than conventional approaches and achieved objectives that lasted beyond our deployment. More importantly, it demonstrated that the leadership style I'd been developing for 2 decades wasn't just effective in small unit operations, it scaled to strategic-level command. The success of Operation Steady Shield brought international attention and, inevitably, more criticism from those who believed military leaders should focus solely on combat operations. A particularly scathing editorial in a military journal accused me of turning the Army into a quote 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 quote. Soldier morale in FORSCOM was at historic highs. Retention rates improved, mission success rates increased. And quietly, other commanders began adopting similar approaches to their operations. The validation I'd been seeking my entire career came from an unexpected source. During a Pentagon briefing on global security threats, I found myself sitting next to General James Morrison, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a legendary figure known for his aggressive leadership style and his skepticism of what he called soft power approaches. "Mitchell," he said quietly during a break in the briefing, "I owe you an apology." "Sir? I was one of the officers who questioned your promotion to 4 stars. I thought your approach was too gentle for strategic command." He paused, studying the briefing materials. "I was wrong. What you've achieved with FORSCOM, the way you've integrated humanitarian and combat operations, it's exactly what modern warfare requires. But the most meaningful validation came during a visit to Fort Campbell, where I addressed the same type of formation I'd once stood before as a nervous second lieutenant. Looking out at hundreds of soldiers, I saw the same mix of skepticism and curiosity I'd encountered decades earlier. Some of you are wondering what a four-star general who supposedly cares too much about casualties and civilians can teach you about being warriors, I began. I'm here to tell you that caring deeply about your mission and your people isn't weakness. It's the foundation of everything that makes our military effective. After the formation, a young lieutenant approached me. She was small, blonde, and looked remarkably like the girl I'd once been. Her name tag read Johnson. "General Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the same nervous determination I remembered from my own early career. "I wanted to thank you. When I was growing up, people told me I was too soft for military service. Seeing your career, knowing that someone like me could achieve what you've achieved, it changed everything." Looking at Lieutenant Johnson, I saw myself 30 years earlier. I saw every woman who'd ever been told she didn't belong, every person who'd been judged by their appearance rather than their capabilities, every leader who'd been criticized for caring too much. "Lieutenant," I said, "don't let anyone else define what kind of leader you should be. The military needs officers who think strategically, who care about their people, and who understand that true strength comes from building others up. Don't try to be someone else's version of tough. Be your own version of effective." 6 months later, I stood once again on the tarmac at Fort Braxton, this time for a ceremony marking the largest peacekeeping operation deployment in a decade. As helicopters lifted off carrying soldiers trained in both combat operations and humanitarian assistance, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The girl from Millbrook, Alabama, who'd been told she was too soft for military service, was now commanding nearly 1 million soldiers. The young woman who'd been criticized for caring too much about casualties was leading operations that saved both military and civilian lives. The officer who'd been accused of hesitation was making strategic decisions that shaped global security. As the last helicopter disappeared into the distance, I felt the weight of the 4 stars on my chest, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Every person who'd ever doubted me, every voice that had told me I didn't belong, had unknowingly contributed to my success by forcing me to become better, stronger, and more determined. But more than that, they'd taught me that the qualities they saw as weaknesses, my empathy, my thoughtfulness, my refusal to see people as expendable resources, were actually my greatest strengths as a leader. Standing there in full gear with 4 silver stars gleaming on my chest, I finally understood what I'd been trying to prove all these years. I wasn't too soft for military service. The military had been too hard without leaders like me. And now, after decades of proving that caring deeply and leading effectively weren't mutually exclusive, I was exactly where I belonged. Not despite being told I was too soft, but because I'd learned to transform that supposed weakness into my greatest strength. The 8-year-old girl who dreamed of serving her country had become the woman who'd redefined what military leadership could be. And every young person who'd ever been told they didn't fit the traditional mold of what a warrior should look like could now point to my stars and know that there was a place for them too. They said I was too soft, until I proved that soft could be steel, and steel could have a heart. The years that followed would test that philosophy in ways I never anticipated. 3 years into my tenure as FORSCOM commander, global tensions escalated dramatically. A coalition of hostile nations had formed an alliance that threatened multiple U.S. allies simultaneously. The situation required the largest military mobilization since World War II, and as FORSCOM commander, I was responsible for deploying and sustaining over 400,000 troops across 4 different theaters of operation. The Pentagon War Room buzzed with activity as generals, admirals, and defense officials worked around the clock to coordinate the response. I found myself at the center of strategic decisions that would affect millions of lives and potentially reshape global politics. "General Mitchell," said Defense Secretary Chen during one particularly intense planning session, "we need your assessment on deployment timelines. Some members of Congress are pushing for immediate, overwhelming force projection. I studied the intelligence reports spread across the conference table. The conventional military wisdom suggested rapid, massive deployment to multiple fronts simultaneously. But my experience had taught me that sustainable operations required more than just overwhelming firepower. Madam Secretary, I recommend a phased deployment strategy. We establish secure footholds in each theater, build local partnerships, and create sustainable supply lines before committing to major offensive operations. General Morrison, who had become one of my strongest supporters, nodded in agreement, but Admiral Rebecca Torres, Chief of Naval Operations, looked skeptical. General Mitchell, that approach will take months longer than direct deployment. Our allies are requesting immediate assistance. Admiral Torres, our allies need assistance that will last, not assistance that burns out after 6 months. We've seen what happens when we commit forces faster than we can sustain them. The debate continued for hours, but eventually, my strategic approach was approved. Over the following 18 months, Operation Global Shield became the largest and most complex military deployment in modern history. But unlike previous large-scale operations, it was characterized by careful coordination with civilian populations, integration of humanitarian aid, and partnership development with local forces. The operation's success was unprecedented. Not only did we achieve all military objectives, but we did so with the lowest casualty rates in modern warfare history. More importantly, the regions we secured remained stable long after our combat forces departed, because we'd built relationships and infrastructure that supported lasting peace. The accolades came from unexpected sources. Foreign military leaders who had initially questioned American strategy began adopting similar approaches. The United Nations cited Operation Global Shield as a model for future peacekeeping operations. And perhaps most significantly, military academies around the world began teaching case studies based on our integrated combat humanitarian methodology. But the moment that meant the most to me came during a return visit to Millbrook, Alabama. The town had grown since my childhood, but it still retained the small-town character that had shaped my early years. The local VFW had organized a homecoming celebration, and as I walked through the streets where I had once been dismissed as too soft for military service, I was struck by how much had changed. Mrs. Thornton, my former guidance counselor, now in her 80s, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah," she said, using my first name as she had when I was 17, "I owe you the biggest apology of my life. When you told me you wanted to go to West Point, I thought I was protecting you by suggesting something more suitable." "Mrs. Thornton, you don't need to apologize. You were trying to help." She shook her head firmly. "No, I was limiting you based on my own narrow understanding of what leadership looked like. You've shown that the military didn't need another aggressive commander. It needed someone who could combine strength with wisdom, power with compassion." The town square ceremony that evening drew hundreds of people. As I stood at the podium where I'd once been introduced as our local Girl Scout, I looked out at faces that represented my entire journey. My parents, now in their 80s but beaming with pride. Former classmates who'd once called me Army Barbie in tones of mockery. Teachers who'd tried to redirect my ambitions toward more appropriate careers. 30 years ago, I began. Many of you thought I was making a mistake by pursuing a military career. You worried that I was too soft, too gentle, too small for that world. And you know what? You were right to worry. The crowd stirred, uncertain where I was heading. You were right to worry because the military I was entering had very narrow definitions of strength and leadership. But here's what you didn't anticipate. Sometimes institutions need people who don't fit the existing mold. Sometimes progress requires leaders who bring different perspectives, different strengths, different ways of solving problems. I paused, looking at the faces of people who'd known me since childhood. I didn't succeed by becoming someone else. I succeeded by insisting that the military needed leaders who cared deeply, thought strategically, and understood that true strength comes from building others up rather than tearing them down. The girl you thought was too soft became a general, precisely because she refused to let others define what strength should look like. The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most were the individual conversations afterward. Young women approached me with stories of their own ambitions and the obstacles they faced. Parents thanked me for showing their daughters that leadership came in many forms. Even some of my former skeptics admitted they'd learned something about the value of different perspectives. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing in the backyard where I'd once played war games with my action figures. My mother joined me, her presence as comforting as it had been throughout my childhood. "You know," she said quietly, "I spent so many years worrying about you, wondering if you were strong enough for the challenges you'd face. And now?" She smiled, the same gentle smile that had once tried to redirect my military ambitions toward teaching. "Now I understand that I was asking the wrong question. It wasn't whether you were strong enough for the military. It was whether the military was ready for the kind of strength you brought to it." 6 months later, I received a call that would mark the beginning of my final chapter in military service. The president was considering me for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the United States, responsible for advising the president and coordinating all branches of the armed forces. "General Mitchell," said the president's chief of staff during our preliminary conversation, "the president is impressed with your strategic innovations and operational successes, but there are concerns about whether your collaborative approach would be effective in the most senior military position." There it was again, the same fundamental question that had followed me throughout my career. Was my leadership style, built on empathy and strategic thinking, rather than aggressive dominance, suitable for the highest levels of command? "Sir," I replied, "I believe that collaborative leadership is exactly what our military needs in an increasingly complex global environment. The challenges we face require building coalitions, maintaining partnerships, and thinking beyond pure military solutions." The nomination process would take months, but as I prepared for what might be my final promotion, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. From the 8-year-old girl in Millbrook who'd been told her dreams were too big, to the potential chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who had redefined what military leadership could accomplish. The voices that had once called me too soft had become a distant whisper, drowned out by decades of results, recognition, and respect. But more importantly, those early criticisms had forced me to develop a leadership philosophy that had ultimately transformed not just my own career, but the entire approach to modern military operations. Standing in my Pentagon office, looking at the 4 stars that represented not just rank but a fundamental shift in how the military understood strength and leadership, I finally had my answer to everyone who'd ever doubted me. I wasn't too soft for military service. I was exactly what military service needed to evolve into something better, stronger, and more effective than it had ever been before. And every young person who would follow in my footsteps would know that strength comes in many forms, leadership has many faces, and sometimes the greatest victories are won not by those who fight the hardest, but by those who fight the smartest. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.